In the early 20th century, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. Its standard of living surpassed France, Germany, and even Canada. Buenos Aires dazzled with its luxury, attracting immigrants from all over the globe. Elegant mansions, wide boulevards, and grand theaters made the city resemble Paris, while the country's economy was growing at an incredible pace. Everything seemed perfect: a booming agricultural export industry, a thriving middle class, and political stability. Argentina was a true symbol of success, a land of opportunity for those seeking a better life. But within just a few decades, everything changed. The economy collapsed, inflation spiraled out of control, and the country plunged into an endless cycle of crises. What went wrong? How did a nation once standing among the world's leaders end up experiencing 9 defaults? Today, we'll break down the key moments that led Argentina to disaster. And at the end, we'll reveal the final blow that erased any hope of the country returning to prosperity. Argentina's wealth was built on agriculture. Its vast pastures and fertile soil allowed the country to become one of the largest suppliers of meat and grain in the world. European nations eagerly bought Argentine goods, and the government confidently spent its profits on infrastructure and social programs. Export revenues soared, and the economy seemed unstoppable. However, everything hinged on external demand. Argentina was like a restaurant with only one customer: Europe. As long as Europe kept ordering, business thrived. But when that customer stopped coming, everything fell apart. The Great Depression of 1929 was catastrophic for Argentina. Demand for its goods plummeted, exports collapsed, and government revenue vanished. With no alternative sources of income, the economy fell into chaos. Millions lost their jobs, and political stability crumbled into turmoil. This was only the beginning of a series of crises that proved Argentina had built its fortune on a dangerously unstable foundation. After the economic crash of the 1930s, Argentina lost something crucial: trust in its leadership. Politicians failed to provide effective solutions, and the country fell into a cycle of endless anticipation for change that never came. A new era of military coups began, with each new regime promising to fix the mistakes of the last. In 1930, the military overthrew the civilian government for the first time, starting a pattern that would continue for decades. Generals took power with harsh measures, pledging to restore order, but instead, corruption and repression flourished. When power returned to democratic leaders, they attempted to make up for past brutality with social reforms, which only ballooned government spending and made the economy even more unstable. The political scene became a battleground for short-term gains. Instead of making strategic decisions, leaders embraced populist policies that deepened the crisis. Public trust in institutions eroded, and instability became the norm. But the most dangerous development was yet to come: a charismatic leader who promised radical change and the support of the people. The Argentine economy is like a bus where no one can agree on the destination. Each new driver comes in with their own route, promising to lead everyone to a brighter future. But just as they step on the gas, the passengers start arguing over which way to go. Eventually, the driver gets thrown out, and another enthusiast takes the wheel with a fresh set of promises. Some drivers try to be cautious, but they're immediately swarmed by officials demanding free tickets for everyone. Others decide to floor it, forgetting that there's barely any fuel left. Passengers have long stopped panicking. Some have even started selling seats at ridiculous prices since no one knows how much longer the bus will run. Meanwhile, someone suggests bringing in foreign investors to fix the bus, but they just glance at each other and refuse to get on board. Just when it seems things can't get worse, a new passenger steps in. Someone who promises to finally fix everything once and for all: Perón. By the 1940s, Argentina faced a choice: continue its chaotic attempts at economic recovery or trust a strong leader. That leader was Juan Perón, a man who won the hearts of workers and presented himself as the protector of the common people. Perón introduced a radically new path. He raised wages, expanded social programs, and gave workers a sense of importance. For the first time in years, people felt like the government was on their side. His wife, the legendary Eva Perón, became the voice of the poor and reinforced her husband's cult of personality. But all these reforms came at a massive cost. The money for social programs wasn't backed by economic growth, but by state reserves and the printing press. Perón relied on heavy government intervention, nationalizing businesses and restricting private enterprise. At first, it seemed like his policies were working, but soon, the economy overheated. Rising expenses, price controls, and overwhelming bureaucracy created hidden problems that began piling up. What started as an era of prosperity soon turned into a ticking time bomb. Juan Perón managed to create the illusion of prosperity. He raised wages, expanded social programs, and built schools and hospitals. Workers adored him, and the state seemed strong and caring. But behind it all lay a massive problem. The money funding these projects didn't come from economic growth, but from government reserves and the printing press. Perón launched large-scale nationalization. Railways, businesses, and banks all came under state control. The private sector was suffocated by bureaucracy, losing its competitiveness. Production declined, exports shrank, yet the government continued to assure people that everything was under control. Inflation soared, but the government tried to contain it through artificial price controls. This led to shortages, a rise in the black market, and rampant speculation. It soon became clear that the system was cracking at the seams. What appeared to be a golden era was actually a house of cards that couldn't last forever. And when resources ran out, Argentina faced its first major crisis, shattering the illusion of stability Perón had built. In the 1920s, Buenos Aires was one of the most luxurious cities in the world. It was called the Paris of South America, with wide boulevards, grand theaters, and European architecture. Aristocrats dined in lavish restaurants, tango filled the streets, and the standard of living was higher than in most European countries. A century later, Argentina's capital tells a very different story. Abandoned buildings, mass protests, and economic instability. Inflation renders money worthless, and poverty levels rise year after year. How did a city once synonymous with wealth end up like this? Political missteps, populism, and ineffective governance eroded the country's economic foundation. While other nations strengthened their institutions and adapted to global challenges, Argentina remained stuck in a cycle of crisis. What was the key reason for this decline? How did a country that was once wealthier than France and Germany find itself on the edge of economic collapse? The answer lies in decisions made decades earlier. As Argentina's economy began to falter, the government found a simple solution: borrowing money. International creditors were willing to lend, as the country was still seen as promising. These loans funded social programs, covered budget deficits, and stabilized the economy. At first, it seemed like a way out of the crisis, but instead of implementing structural reforms, the government continued accumulating debt. Each new loan wasn't used for industrial or technological development, but to patch up existing financial holes. Debt levels soared, while economic growth stagnated. Eventually, the debt became unsustainable. By the 1980s, Argentina was in crisis, and in 2001, the country declared the largest default in its history, refusing to pay over $100 billion. Each new round of borrowing only deepened Argentina's dependency. But the worst was yet to come: massive currency devaluation that would threaten not just the economy, but the daily lives of millions of Argentinians. Imagine a person who orders the most expensive dish at a restaurant, pays for 5-star vacations, and hands out money to friends left and right. Everyone assumes he must have an enormous income, but in reality, he's living off his credit card. Every month, he convinces himself that he'll start saving soon, but when the bills come due, he just takes out another loan to cover the old one. Eventually, the bank catches on and realizes he can't repay his debts. They raise his interest rates, cut his credit limit, and eventually refuse to lend him more money. In a panic, he turns to friends for loans, but they too start seeing the truth. They won't be getting their money back. This was Argentina's economy for decades. The country lived on borrowed money, covering old debts with new ones, until creditors finally said, "No more." That's when the real chaos began, sparking one of the worst crises in Argentina's history. Argentina has gone down in history as one of the most default-prone countries. Each new crisis only worsened the situation, investors lost trust, and the economy became more vulnerable. The most infamous default came in 2001, when Argentina refused to repay over $100 billion, leading to mass protests, business bankruptcies, and frozen bank accounts. People lost access to their savings, inflation skyrocketed, and unemployment reached record highs. After each crisis, governments promised recovery, but instead of long-term solutions, they resorted to more borrowing and populist measures. This led to yet another economic collapse. International creditors became increasingly reluctant to lend to Argentina, while its citizens grew accustomed to the reality that their national currency could lose value within days. But another factor would soon emerge, one that would completely destabilize the financial system. Argentina didn't just suffer economic crises, it operated in a system where corruption became the norm. Every new president promised to fight corruption, but once in power, they became entangled in the same schemes. As a result, any attempts at reform either failed or were exploited for personal gain. Government contracts were handed out to allies, infrastructure funds mysteriously vanished, and big businesses had to play along with corrupt officials to survive. Small and medium enterprises increasingly moved into the informal economy, as high taxes and bureaucratic hurdles made legal operations unprofitable. Law enforcement and the judicial system were unable to control the corruption. Trust in institutions eroded to the point where Argentinians no longer believed in justice. People relied more on personal connections than on laws. In such an environment, the economy couldn't function efficiently. But soon another problem would arise, one that would impact not only government finances, but the daily lives of millions of citizens. Once upon a time, Argentina's peso was a stable currency that allowed people to save and plan for the future. But today, inflation is so high that store prices change weekly. The national currency has gone through multiple devaluations, rebranding, and hyperinflationary periods where money lost value faster than it could be printed. From the mid-1970s to the early 1990s, Argentina suffered from devastating hyperinflation. As part of a series of currency reforms, one new peso introduced in 1992 was equivalent to 100 billion old pesos from before 1983. This level of devaluation shattered trust in the national currency. Today, Argentinians measure prices in millions and spend their salaries immediately, knowing their money will be worth less in just a few days. How did a once prosperous country let its currency collapse? And why do Argentinians still mistrust their own money today? Another major factor was about to seal the fate of Argentina's economic system. At the beginning of the 20th century, Australia, Canada, and Argentina had similar economic models. All three countries were rich in natural resources, dependent on exports, and had vast territories with low population density. However, a century later, Australia and Canada became developed economies, while Argentina found itself trapped in an endless cycle of crises. The key difference lay in institutions and governance. Australia and Canada built stable governmental institutions, an independent judicial system, and a transparent tax policy. Their governments implemented reforms aimed at long-term development rather than short-term popularity. Argentina, on the other hand, remained stuck in a cycle of populism, short-sighted policies, and eroding trust in authority. Instead of stability, its economy was shaped by frequent shifts in direction, nationalizations, and abrupt reforms that lacked consistency. While other countries adapted to new challenges, Argentina continued repeating the same mistakes. But another blow was coming, one that would further diminish the country's chances of returning to prosperity. If Argentina's economy were a textbook, it would consist of only 2 chapters. The first would be called How to Build a Thriving Country, and the second, How to Destroy It in 3 simple steps. In the first stage, everything looks perfect. The country grows wealthier, infrastructure develops, and the standard of living rises. Then comes the second phase. Politicians come up with brilliant ideas. They start handing out money that isn't backed by economic growth, impose price controls, and nationalize successful enterprises. Each new government insists that it has found the solution to all problems, but after a few years, a crisis hits. The budget dries up, currency devalues, and investors flee the country. Then comes the most radical decision, to declare default and ask international creditors for money. Soon enough, the cycle starts again. This time, we'll get it right. And once more, the same scenario plays out. Argentina has gone through this process so many times that it almost seems like part of its national tradition. But one event would finally erase any hope for economic recovery. All the crises, defaults, inflation, and corruption in Argentina might have been overcome. The economy had its ups and downs, but there was always a chance for recovery. However, one factor ultimately sealed its fate: total loss of trust. Citizens no longer trusted their currency. Businesses didn't trust the government, and investors saw no reason to put money into a country where laws changed every few years. Every new president promised reforms, but instead of systemic changes, the economy continued to teeter on the edge of collapse. When trust disappears, no reform can succeed. Even if the government announced a new economic program tomorrow, people would immediately look for ways to protect themselves, converting money to dollars, moving capital abroad, and investing in real estate instead of business development. This is why Argentina, once one of the wealthiest countries in the world, remains trapped in a cycle of crises. And until trust in institutions is restored, the country's future will remain uncertain.